Dr. Eric Balkowicz, we're back for another edition of Thyroid Thursday. And today I want to kind of follow up on last week's Thyroid Thursday edition where we talked about why women have a tendency to have higher levels of hypothyroid symptoms and higher rates of autoimmune disorders, especially autoimmune attack on the thyroid gland. And one of the things we talked about was that women carry more leptin just naturally because they have higher levels of estrogen. And I said this week I would talk about what are some natural ways that you can bring your leptin levels down. Well, there's a couple things you can do. Number one, reduce your carbohydrate intake. So the more carbohydrates you consume, the greater the chance that you're going to overconsume glucose, use more than you need, promote more fat storage. And remember, anytime you increase fat storage, you increase leptin. The more you continue the cycle of carb overload, increased fat production, increased leptin, you can get into that cycle of leptin resistance where the brain just stops listening to the leptin signals. You keep eating, increasing carbs, increasing fat storage, increasing leptin resistance, and the whole inflammatory cascade just continues to cycle out of control. So reduce your carbohydrate load, move towards a more low carb, higher fat, mild to moderate protein diet. Look at things like a ketogenic diet or keto adapted type lifestyle. There's plenty of resources available to kind of get into that role, but definitely one of the simplest things to do is to cut down your carb load. Easiest way to do that is cut out the breads, the pastas, the grains. They're not necessary for optimal health. Eat foods more like they came out of the ground, walk the earth, came out of the ocean or off the tree. So eat real food. If it's got more than 2 or 3 ingredients on the label, don't eat it. Eat real food. It's probably the simplest recommendation I can give you. Second thing is start strength training. If you start strength training and building more lean muscle mass, you're going to have a tendency to be able to manage more carbohydrates. Now, we don't want to be loading our body with carbohydrates, but by building more lean muscle mass, you're able to burn more carbohydrates. Therefore, there's a greater chance of getting more of that glucose that you get into the body into your muscle tissues and utilized than getting stored as fat and triggering more leptin response, okay? Third thing is do cardio correctly. One of the biggest challenges for people is their thought process is if I'm gonna burn fat, I gotta do chronic cardio, and I'm gonna run, and I'm gonna run, and I'm gonna work hard. And what I find and what I see, and we see this quite often in the endurance community, is we're just training wrong. We're not training in a fat burning heart rate. We're training more at a kind of a carbohydrate burning heart rate when we're in intensity. And so we do this kind of chronic cardio. We're not getting better at burning fat. We're actually churning and burning, and our body's craving more carbohydrates. So we get done our chronic cardio workout. Didn't help us metabolize or burn fat. We're starving when we get done. We eat lots of carbohydrates to kind of refuel ourselves because our body's craving the sugars to kind of replenish what we burned off, and it continues to create a vicious cycle. One of the best things that you can do if you're going to do cardiovascular training is to do cardiovascular training appropriately. Get a heart rate monitor, take 180 minus your age, and then you want to stay at whatever level that is, minus about 10 points. So if you're 50 years old and you take 180 and you minus 50, then your aerobic training range where you're going to burn fat as a primary fuel source is going to be somewhere between 130 and 120. That's the rate you want to train in. You'll be surprised at how slow you almost have to go to build a true aerobic base and get your body into a fat burning mode. So if you're going to do cardio, don't just go out there and run as hard as you can every time you go out just so you can feel like you had an exercise. Start building a proper aerobic base where your body's burning fat and not constantly looking for carbohydrates, because that will drive you to eat more carbohydrates, which will drive more inflammation, it'll drive more leptin, and drive that whole cascade we talked about last week. 4, I really recommend you work with a functional medicine doctor for a couple of reasons. One, you want to check for insulin resistance or find out if you're already in an insulin resistant state. So you can run your glucose, your hemoglobin A1C, you can look at triglycerides and lactose dehydrogenase, and your doctor will probably run your leptin levels as well. So you want to look to see if you're already in this high leptin resistant, insulin resistant state. So you want to work with a functional medicine doctor to run those tests. Why do I say a functional medicine doctor? Because it's usually the functional medicine doctor that's looking and running those tests. Traditional medicine just really doesn't typically run those tests unless they're assuming you're already diabetic. Next thing is, we talked about leptin resistance. Evaluate for estrogen problems and estrogen dominance. Like we talked about last week, as you increase estrogen levels, you increase leptin. Increased leptin increases inflammation. A lot of women have estrogen imbalances, and they have estrogen dominance. They have a hard time detoxing estrogen out of the system, which creates that estrogen dominance. If you work with a functional medicine practitioner like myself, we'll be able to do an appropriate hormone panel, appropriate hormone testing to find out if that's a challenge for you, and then we can give you strategies to lower that or balance that naturally. The next thing to think about is get your inflammatory markers checked. So there's a number of inflammatory markers that a functional medicine practitioner can run for you. If you have higher levels of inflammation, that's going to drive up leptin, it's going to drive that autoimmune and cellular hypothyroid state. So a functional medicine doctor is going to do that for you. Unfortunately, in traditional medicine, a lot of those markers are rarely run on a traditional metabolic panel. Next thing to be looking for with your functional medicine doctor is to look for any signs of infection. You may not think you have any infection, but the gut is the window to a lot of infectious processes. So work with a functional medicine doctor. They can do some testing to find out if you've got yeast overgrowth, bacterial overgrowth, two things that have really been tied to driving autoimmune conditions as well as viruses and parasites. Last thing you want to be checking with your functional medicine doctor is cortisol levels, because cortisol, good to a certain range, but high levels or low levels aren't good, and high levels can definitely drive inflammatory processes, driving that cellular hypothyroidism, driving autoimmunity. So work with your functional medicine doctor to evaluate cortisol levels if that's appropriate. Last thing, work on improving your sleep, rest, and recovery. It's really important. There's a great tool, it's called heart rate variability, that you can use to kind of assess your heart rate variability, which is an indication if you're in sympathetic fight or flight response, or parasympathetic, which is rest and digest response. Heart rate variability will let you know when you've recovered. There's some really neat apps that you can use on your iPhone. One of those I really like is called HRV for Training. You'll want to pick that up at the App Store and then start testing your HRV every day. And definitely work on improving sleep. Overall, what can you do to reduce your leptin levels? Number one thing is, easy answer to sum all this up, is to reduce your stress. Physical stress, emotional stress, chemical stress, and environmental and microbial stressors. Reduce the stress load, you reduce leptin, you reduce inflammation, reduce body fat, and reduce those hypothyroid symptoms, and reduce the risk of developing autoimmunity if you haven't developed it already, or continuing to develop more autoimmunity. All right, hope that helps. If you have any questions, put it in the question box below, or give the office a call, and we'll be more than happy to help you out. Thanks.